And Mrs. Dyer was a great niece of Mr. Hoops. He came from Ohio over here. He figured that 100 miles south of Chicago, they should build two railroads and they would cross. And sure enough, they did. That happened. And let's see, the two railroads crossed. Oh, and Mr. Hoops had cattle and sheep in Ohio. Well, his sister had 15 children, and her and her husband was going to California in a covered wagon, and they stopped by Mr. Hoops, and they had 15 children, and they knew where different ones lived, and they'd go there and they'd leave a child. I thought that was so terrible, to leave their children with their relatives. And so when they got to Mr. Hoops's house, they left their little 6-year-old daughter, Mary. And so one day they went to Rossville on business, and they had to go in a horse and a buggy. So coming home that evening, it was getting dark, and they had to pull off into a farmer's and asked if they'd stay all night, which the farmer said yes. And the farmer took their horse and undone it from the buggy and put it in the barn and give it corn and water and tied it up so it couldn't get out. So, and while they was gone, a wolf came scratching at the front door. And they had no locks on the door. And little Mary had a little lamp. So she went in the kitchen and brought a kitchen chair out there and put it underneath the door so the wolf couldn't get in. The wolf couldn't have got in anyway, but she didn't know that. And the hired man was upstairs sleeping. So the next morning, the Hoopses came home, and Mary told them what happened, what she did. And they raised Mary. And let's see. Oh, and Mr. Hoops, when he moved to where he lived, he left a herd of cattle and a sheep. And he had two of his sister's sons, 20 and 21 or 22 years of age, to drive those cattle over here and those sheep, all the way from Ohio. I don't see why he didn't sell them and buy others when he got over here, but he didn't. And then they went on to California, this couple, and left little Mary with the Hoopses. Well, Mary was 6 years old. Her mother had got married, and her father died. And she was 6 years old. And then her mother married another man, and she lived with him 5 years. And then she divorced him and married another man. Well, she lived with this other man for about 5 years, and he died. Well, then she married this other man back. She lived with him for about 5 or 6 years, and he died. And she buried both of them at the cemetery of, I forgot. Anyway, she buried them both side by side. And she went to California to San Diego, and she lived in a hotel, and she had money coming in from both of her husbands, and she lived in a hotel for 40 years, and then she came back to see Mrs. Dyer, and she rented an apartment in Champaign, a furnished apartment, and she got sick and died. And Mrs. Dyer had her cremated and had her ashes put in an urn, set them up on the fireplace. Well, Mrs. Dyer had friends, and they would have card parties. One would have a card party, then the next, all like that. So one afternoon, Mrs. Dyer had her card party, and one of the ladies said, "Irma, have you buried your mom's ashes?" And Mrs. Dyer said no. They were sitting in the urn up on the up on the
Mantle.
up above the fireplace. And she said, this woman said, "Well, when we get done playing cards, why don't you call Charlie and tell him to come and get a spade and go down, take your mom's ashes, and go down to Champaign or Urbana, whichever, and bury your mom's ashes." So Mrs. Dyer told her all right. So that's what she did.